Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Cityforum event. If I can hand over now to Marc Lee, who's going to introduce today's meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted you can join us for our discussion today. This is the first of 4 sessions in the late autumn winter period, British policing at an inflection point, communities, leadership, performance. We've had considerable help from Martin Hewitt in the preparation of this particular programme, and we're very delighted that he could be with us to open the session today, moving from one keynote engagement to the next, from 1 second to the next. Very grateful to you for being with us. We've looked at the Peelian Principles and their applicability on 3 occasions in the last 20 years. Once at the time of the global financial crisis, when we did a piece of work starting with Sir Dennis O'Connor, Sir Tom Winsor's predecessor as Chief Inspector. Then just before the pandemic, we did another in the light of technology and had President Dick, Sarah Thornton and Lynn Owens leading a fascinating discussion. We're delighted today to start with Martin and to have Sir Tom back again, who has helped us on a number of occasions, providing very formidable intellectual inputs to what we've been doing. They will start the discussion on the applicability of Peelian Principles to the current situation and what we may expect. And following that, we have various contributors we're delighted to see. Hazel Blears, with whom I had particular pleasure as chairman of Cityforum in working with while she was developing her community policing strategy when she was Minister for Policing in the first decade of this particular century. It was one of the areas of activity that we most enjoyed and felt we had a constructive role in. We're also particularly pleased to have Peter McCall, a newly elected member of the group of police and crime commissioners from helping us from Cumbria. We have a younger person from Policing Reform and Change, Caroline Hay, whom we're particularly delighted to have with us. And coming back onto our programme after a quite long absence, Professor Justice Tankebe of Cambridge University, who has provided some very serious intellectual inputs on various Cityforum occasions in the past. But we have an excellent panel. We have in the chair Mary Callum, who does these things beautifully. Short speeches, she'll introduce that part of it. On the record, unless speakers asked to be off the record specifically. Second part, Chatham House rule, as much frankness as possible. We're most pleased to have you all with us. Without the support of BT, Cisco, who consistently help us with our policing projects, and the help of Accenture and Motorola, these activities wouldn't be possible. We're extremely grateful to them. BT, Cisco, Accenture and Motorola will all be speaking in later parts of the programme. So delighted to have you in the chair, Mary, and delighted to turn myself into a kind of assistant scribe for the occasion and resort to my normal role. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. And I think it's going to be a toss-up between you and Tom as to who wins the book collection award for backgrounds in this webinar. Thank you for the opportunity to chair this. It's clearly a timely session. Policing is always in the news, but it seems to have been a bit more in the news lately, with some really challenging issues that go to the heart of public confidence and trust in the police. So really good time to be doing this, and a great set of speakers to help us to do it. My role in all this is purely as umpire and timekeeper. So just to give you the sort of basics of how this is going to run, I'm going to ask our distinguished speakers to take turns, speak one after the other. I am going to ask them to do their level best to speak for no more than 7 minutes each. And if any of you get too carried away, I shall gently remind you of the time. Audience members, please do use the chat function if you have comments and questions. Do that at any point in the course of the proceedings. But once our speakers have finished, we will then turn to a discussion session where we will take your questions and comments, and I will ventriloquise those to the panel. And that will be a Chatham House discussion. And we'll aim to be finished at about 4 o'clock. So with no further ado, Martin, can I ask you to lead off, please?
Thanks, Mary. And so I suppose if Caroline's the young voice, that must make me the old voice, which is rather depressing, but there we are. OK, good afternoon, everyone. I will stick to my 7 minutes. And what I want to do is just kind of, I guess, lay a bit of a background around the Peelian Principles and their applicability in where we are now. For me, the whole point of the principles for me, which links to what what Mary has just said, is around legitimacy. The purpose of those principles when they were first invented, they were about creating a legitimacy for an organisation that for the first time was becoming kind of legally present and in an organised fashion. And I do think they remain as an interesting set of tests against our legitimacy as the service today. But clearly the challenges that we face today and policing faces today are very different from those that were in the minds of the individuals that were framing the original principles. And what I kind of propose to do is talk a little bit about the core ideas and then pick out a handful of the actual principles and if you like, bring them into the context of where we are now and argue that whilst I think they have a relevance, we have to take them as relevant, but in a way that is also challenging as well. So I think there are 3 core ideas that come out of the principles. The first one is that it was all about prevention first, and I think that is something that we remain quite challenged as a service and more collectively. But of course, the other point I think that's really, if you like, that environmental point is that in the way that the police service was conceived back in 1829, the role of police was dominant in the work that they were doing. I think the work of prevention in 2021 is much more broadly based in terms of the kind of issues that we need to deal with. And I'll come on to that in a little bit. They were all about being based on public support. The concept of policing on these islands is that it is done with the support of the public. And that, for me, that support is based around trust and confidence. And I think that's the challenge that we have to, in a very contemporary way, but throughout the years of the service, we've had to test ourselves. And I would argue there are 2 questions that a citizen has to ask in terms of deciding whether they have trust and confidence in the service. The first question for me is, do I trust that you will treat me fairly? And I think in the UK, the vast majority of people probably will automatically answer that question yes, without really giving it much thought. But there are significant minority communities within the UK that would not answer that question yes, and in some cases answer it very definitely no. So those issues about how we establish that confidence around fairness, which definitely would have been in the minds of the framers of the principles in the beginning, is really important. But there's also a really important second question for me as well, which is, if you like, are you, the police, going to be relevant? And by that I mean, are you going to do something that is useful for me? And this is the one that for me gets you into the performance territory. You know, the police service is there to keep people safe, to make people feel safe, and therefore we have to be relevant to the things that make people unsafe or make people feel unsafe. And that shifts and changes, and arguably has changed dramatically in the last probably decade, largely due to technology, and then what technology does in terms of opening up all of us to victimization from places that we would not have dealt with that before. If you think back to the days when these principles were first delivered, they were entirely about a localized public space policing response. And of course, we are now in a globalized all space and virtual space policing response. So whilst there is relevance, we've got to look at that contextual difference. So taking us right into 2021, some key principles and where I think they're really important and challenged. The principle there about that the impact of the service is diminished negatively by use of force, use of compulsion, and we have to constantly challenge ourselves around that. I would look at the way we approached the lockdown regulations. You know, when I set the strategy for Octala, the overriding strategic objective was we need to come out the other end of this with the public having as much trust in us or potentially more by the way that we deal with what were going to be these absolutely unique regulations. So really thinking about this is about a model where we get people, where we're not compelling people, we get people's cooperation. But think again about the response to the killing of George Floyd and all that flowed from there, and the work that we are now doing around inclusion and race equality in this country. And a significant strand of that in the middle is about the use of powers and how we use our powers, and particularly how we use our use of force. And then, of course, taking us up to be completely contemporary, the kind of use of force by a police officer, the use of compulsion by a police officer in the kidnap and murder of Sarah Everard, and all that has drawn attention to where we are. So for me, that principle remains very relevant and tested in different ways, but arguably in some senses similar ways to it was originally. Impartial service to the law was another principle which for me takes you into this concept of independence and operational independence. When you read when it was framed at the time, it was largely about not giving people with privilege, people with social status, an advantage over other people. I would argue now we look that through the lens of politics and the impact at a local level in our relationship between policing and political governance at a local level in PCCs, but also at a national level. And I think we are challenged continually, and the line that I am constantly walking is about that balance between working properly and closely with those who have the democratic responsibility for governing, so that we're able to influence and we're able to provide that professional input, but at the same time not being too close so that we are losing that sense of independence and impartiality. And if you look at the example, particularly around how we police protest, disorder, public order, I think that's probably the sort of the friction point that we have at the moment. Police are public and public are police, yes, and we like to trot that one out there as being a given. I think when we look at how we are now, look at some of the debates that are going on at the moment. We're recruiting lots of people, the debates that have been going on very latterly about what police officers should and should not do, how police officers should and should not behave, where they are different, how different are we to members of the public? And that's a very live debate at the moment that no doubt we will get a bit into. And the last of the principles, I'm conscious of the time, Mary, is the absence of crime there versus police presence. And really, I think what the framers were thinking there was, this is not about having loads of visible police in the streets and, if you like, oppressing the public. It's about the absence of crime. And I think that's something we would probably agree with. But I think the challenge for us now is the invisibility of a lot of the crime that we've got to deal with. And that takes you back to that point of mine about relevance. It is not simply now, you simply cannot do policing by being present. Probably the most likely victimization of any of us is in a digital space, and a police officer wandering down the street is not going to impact. So where is the role of police in the crimes that we're facing now? So in summary, I actually think when you look back, it is a remarkable document that, accepting some of the language, all those years later, it still has real relevance, and it you know, an incredible document in that sense. I think it still speaks to those things that should be the foundation for how we police in the UK and how we attempt to police, but it must be contextualized to both the environment in the sort of geographic, but also in the kind of the environment in virtual that we are now. We must take on and meet the challenges of understanding how it's contextualized and not just lazily accepting it. People will often trot the principles out, and I agree with them, but we've got to challenge them, and we've got to say, what does that principle mean in 2021, not what it necessarily meant in 1829. And then lastly, I think for all of us that are in leadership positions, how we police the problems of the 21st century and the challenges in line with the principles of those of the ones that are there from Peel, I think is the leadership challenge that we've all got to take on. But I will stop there, Mary.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. Very thought-provoking. I shall turn now to Tom.
Thanks, Mary. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for everyone joining. I'm going to talk, of course, about the Peelian Principles and performance, because performance is what we in the Inspectorate do. I'll be as succinct as possible because Martin's stolen 2 of my minutes. Well, I'll maybe get them back. So, as you know, we inspect and report on the efficiency and effectiveness of the 43 territorial police forces in England and Wales. We also do forces such as CNC, BTP, and a number of others, as well as the National Crime Agency, which isn't a police force. We were established in 1856, 27 years after Peel established the London Police. So we've been around for a long time. The reforms that, the genius of Peel's reforms as Peel's principles, as Martin has just enunciated, is they are as enduring and relevant today, and they need no modification. I remember attending an event in, I think, 2015 in Birmingham, where lots of chiefs and others had got together to rewrite the Peelian Principles, and it didn't happen. Why? Because they're a work of genius, and they need no reform, they need no improvement, and their enduring nature is very strong. And I'm not going to go through all 9, but I'm just going to pick out a couple. The common consent of the public as opposed to the power of the state. That's the source of the power of the police, and that is of enormous importance. It is enormously important that direct political control of the police does not occur here. It occurs in most other countries, but not here. The police is not the coercive arm of an oppressive executive government. And that feeds into the relationship which the police have with ministers and with elected officials, of course, police and crime commissioners and mayors. And it is of enormous importance that the line of operational independence is not put under any pressure, and it is not crossed. And unfortunately, both those things happen, and they happen too much, too often. As Martin said, our world is a very different place from the one of Robert Peel, but nevertheless, we must be faithful to the principles. Indeed, I came into this job the best part of 10 years ago, and a lot has changed in that time. I'm pleased to say, otherwise we would have failed. But our statutory remit is the same as it was in 1856: efficiency and effectiveness, inspect and report. But we're an inspectorate, not a regulatory authority. We should never be a regulator. Regulators have hard power, the power of intervention, direction and enforcement. Inspectorates have soft power, the power of their voice and their authority. Soft power should not be confused with weak power. It is power of a different nature. We should not be the regulators, because if we were regulators, then we would be the chief constables of England and Wales, because we could override the judgment of a police chief, and that must never, ever happen. In July last year, I published my 8th annual State of the Police report, and we're busy writing number 9, which will be my last. The focus of that, faithful to Peel's principles, was on the state of our country's creaking criminal justice system, defective and dysfunctional as it is, the plight of the most vulnerable in society, the major change programs that are taking place, including the 20,000 officer uplift program, and the work which we have been able to facilitate, whereby forces produce annual force management statements on demand, asset stewardship, condition, capacity, capability, performance, efficiency, security of supply of their workforce, and of course their their money. And underpinning that is when you have a clear assessment, as far as possible, nothing is perfectly accurate, of future demand, all demand, crime and non-crime, latent and patent. You realize that the police don't have enough money to meet all demand. And it is a truism of everything is you cannot meet 100% of projected demand for 70% of its efficient cost. Something has to give, more money or less demand met, or a mixture of the two. So we are in the context of a rapidly, as Martin said, changing world. Technology is galloping very, very fast, and the police have to do everything they can to keep up, because those who will do us harm have no limitations on the abuse of that technology, and that technology just keeps on getting better and better for all the things it can be used for, including the bad things that it can be used for. But the Peelian principle that I care about most is prevention. All of the costs of the criminal justice system are incurred downstream or after the commission of an offence. Upstream, where early prevention is possible, that's where the harm begins. And children exposed to violence or who suffer neglect, young people who can't get the mental health support that they need, drawn into drug taking, into crime, adults who end up, and they become adults who end up caught in the criminal justice system, and a cycle of offending. It just feeds crime. And yet policymakers, and I use that term advisedly, policymakers just don't take enough notice of the need to finance the criminal justice system and to make it as efficient and effective as possible. And that is a matter of very significant regret. For prevention in its purest sense to work, it is essential that the public services that we have, the agencies of the state, work well together. It's not all up to the police. By the time the police are involved, it's usually too late. Something somewhere further upstream could have been done, an earlier intervention that is far cheaper, not just in terms of money and resources, but in terms of human suffering. And yet, policymakers in too many respects close their eyes to that truism and just wait for things to get much, much worse. Those are my reflections, and I think I am 10 seconds under.
Right, you're in pole position for the timing prize, Tom, so far. Well done, thank you. I know that was really interesting. I know you have thought tremendously about the Peelian Principles. I remember having a conversation with you about it when you had not long started in your role. Hazel, can I turn to you next? I know you all have some interesting insights from a very long career across the sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and it's a delight to be with you, and particularly to be able to follow Martin and Tom with immense erudition, but also with a lot of passion. It's great to see passion in this field, because that's what, in my experience, gets things done. I want to talk a little bit about culture, because I think it's almost the unspoken word that is very challenging and very, very relevant in our current circumstances. I was looking at the 3 core ideas that Martin's been through already, and if I think about preventing crime, I agree with Tom that it is basically the overriding priority. Who wants to live in a community where crime is ever present? What ordinary citizens want is the right to go about their daily business without fear of intimidation and particularly violence. The second core principle was about earning public confidence, but also there's some really interesting words in there. It's about respect and trust. And these are quite complex skills and abilities to be able to build up in a community. They're not easy to do, but I think the respect word is absolutely fundamental here. And that is a mutual respect. It's not just for the public to respect the police. It's also for the police to respect the public. And it is a two-way street, and very, very important for that. And the third area for me was around the police must earn public support by respecting community principles. That's quite a complex proposition. It does talk about hard work, enforcing laws impartially, but also hiring officers who respect and understand the community. goes absolutely to recruitment. What are the skills that we're looking for? I would prefer to say that we should recruit for values and train for skills, because if you're not recruiting for the right values, then your chances of actually producing the kind of police officers who can continue to implement the Peelian Principles is very limited indeed. So I think that the Peelian Principles are still extremely relevant, but I do think that they need to be seen in a modern context. And if you go into any workplace, the ones where businesses are successful, where things are going well, they've got a great culture. And you can see that, you can touch it, you can feel it almost from the moment you walk through the door, and particularly for young people. I'm now a member of the Youth Endowment Fund Committee, which is administering a £200 million endowment from government to try and tackle the enormous problems we've got around youth violence and particularly serious knife crime in many of our communities up and down the country. And we have a youth advisory board, which we're just establishing. And I spent a long session with them last week. And these are young people right at the sharp end. All of them have had lived experience of serious violence, of knife crime. And I think perhaps Peel would also have wanted our police officers to be relevant to today and open to that kind of new experience. And perhaps we don't have enough places where the police and people who are at the sharp end are able to have an honest and open and frank discussion about the things that are challenging and the way in which that can be addressed. So the things that I really found, I suppose, very challenging when I first became the police minister was around the recruitment of police, and I'm glad that that's changed, I think, quite dramatically. But I still think that we're recruiting largely from a cohort of people who are young working class men. And, you know, I brought in some of the graduate schemes to be able to try and leaven some of that in the police force. We've still got, you know, 2/3 of police officers being male and only a third female. You start to look up the ranks, and as you get towards more senior ranks, those figures become more stark. So I think the balance between gender, the balance on race, again, you know, I know it's a really difficult uphill struggle, but again, we've got to make much more effort around having some balance in race terms. I was shocked to find that we had a residential culture in training the police, and one of the first things I did as police minister was to end that residential culture. There was no reason why you should go away for 25 weeks with all of your colleagues and be immersed in a particular kind of culture. And indeed, in community policing, police officers were out on the beat under my watch on day one. Accompanied, of course, and supported by other colleagues, but nevertheless, their job was to be in that community and not to be in a residential environment that created a canteen culture with all of the things that we're now reaping in many ways in some of the incidents that we've seen. I ended the residential training for firearms officers because unless you could go away for 13 weeks, you couldn't be a firearms officer. If you were a woman police officer with childcare duties or even looking after the dog, for goodness sake, you couldn't get on a firearms course. And therefore, the firearms section of the police became a very macho environment indeed. So I think that we've still got quite a lot of challenges around the kind of people who are coming into the service. And the other thing that's not been mentioned in all of the recent debate is the influence, and I did particularly want to mention this, the influence of pornography. And I don't know why it hasn't been mentioned. I don't know whether people are embarrassed or whatever about it. But, you know, 3/4 of young men in particular, but also women too, are now regularly using pornography as a routine part of their existence. And if that doesn't commodify both men and women in a sexual way, then I don't know what does. And I think some of that coarsening of our dialogue, the coarsening of our exposure, particularly to fairly hardcore pornography, is part of the cause of what is actually happening in our communities. So again, there are cultural issues around all of that. Do we find it acceptable in a society for young people to be exposed in that way? I would say not, but it's a very contested area, I've no doubt, in terms of civil liberties and the freedom to lead your life in the way that you do. I think that some of the other things that we can do around this is around community policing. And obviously, it's one of the things that I was most passionately in favour of, because all of my political life, I've always believed in doing things with people, not to them, empowering communities to do things for themselves, making them more resilient. And the fact that we could have a neighbourhood policing team in every single community where they got to know all the local people, where they work with housing colleagues, they work with social services, they work with people who were on the drugs teams, you know, they were embedded. They didn't parachute in, sort out a problem, and then go back to where they came from. They absolutely had the feel, the most successful of them had the feel of that local community to be able to do that. So I do think that policing is about relationships at its core. It's about relationships based on a healthy culture of mutual support and respect between citizens and the police. It's not about a series of transactions where something goes wrong, somebody gets arrested, somebody gets locked up. It's a long-term, really powerful relationship. And if you can bring people together in that, then you've really got, dare I say, a force to be reckoned with. My final point really is about collaboration. And that is one of the reasons where I was lucky enough to be able to bring in Clare's Law together with a number of colleagues, and that was about women facing serious violence. And that only worked because housing, social services, the drug services, the police services all came together and were required to have a community conference in order to be able to resolve some of those issues. Serious violence still surrounds us, as we've seen in the very sad case of Sarah Everard. But I would say, you know, community policing was not a nice to have. Community policing actually got results, and that's where Tom's point comes in about performance. Every month I had to appear in front of Tony Blair as the Prime Minister in Downing Street on a round table, and we had a grip meeting. And I think he'd got this idea from Greater Manchester Police, and he sat me in the chair together with my police colleagues, and he grilled me on my targets, on street crime, on robbery, on antisocial behaviour. Were the figures going up? Were they coming down? What were we doing? What were our plans? As a minister, every month I had to report to the Prime Minister. And because our Prime Minister was so involved in this area, I then had the kind of delegated power to be able to make really big progress. And so I would like to see the current government and the Prime Minister, you know, genuinely leading this issue, because leadership does matter, whether that's leadership in the force or leadership in politics. And that way I do think that we can still make some progress. But the challenges are enormous. Most of them are cultural. And I haven't seen so far a real embrace of the cultural challenges in the service. Perhaps it's out there, perhaps it's going on, but I'd like to see a big push on recruiting for values and then training for skills.
Thank you, Hazel. And I suspect we will come back in the discussion to your challenge about changing cultures. Can I turn now to Peter, sitting in front of that very beautiful picture of Cumbria? Over to you.
Well, what a challenge to follow a distinguished former policing minister. Even more of a challenge knowing that she lives on my patch. That's really scary. I would start by noting that whilst I'm approaching this piece as a PCC and not a police officer, it's really important, and others have alluded to this, that policing is a we together and collectively activity. It's not the sole preserve or responsibility of those who serve as police officers. And it's an activity that requires every citizen to play their part, irrespective of any appointed role or responsibility. And that, of course, would accord, I think, perfectly with the most often quoted Peelian principle that the police are the public and the public are the police. In my view, as a PCC and trying to speak on behalf of the public, the principles have never been more important, apposite or essential, because they apply to modern policing as they ever did. But they've been sorely tested in this last year across the world, not just in the UK, by the response to the pandemic and events and changes in society such that it's absolutely right that we continue to assess the applicability of the principles in this changing operating environment. Accepting, as I do, the principles that our aim and collective mission within the policing system should be the absence of crime, or at least low crime rates rather than high arrests. Policing is a function which relies on that essential support of the public to comply with the law, to pay for the function, importantly, and of course to support the police in executing it. But that depends on the ability of the police, as Hazel has just said, to gain and retain the respect and thereby the legitimacy of and from the public. And that respect is earned by respecting community principles, their concerns, by responding effectively to them, building reputation, hard to earn, but very easy to lose, to be impartial, and to be genuinely representative of the community that they serve. And much has been done in this last year to achieve that. And of course, using force, as Martin said, to gain compliance only as a last resort. And if we accept those principles still hold true, then I think we have to accept that our application of them is under pressure. Our legitimacy is challenged by some. And there are some significant challenges, and it's time well invested to understand why. I'm sure we all agree that first and foremost, our job is to serve the public, to protect and serve. But not only do we serve the public, we have to rely on them to make the system work. We need them to observe the law, to cooperate with policing, to fund it. And that latter point really isn't lost on me as a PCC, who increasingly has to go out to the public locally every year for an ever-increasing share of police funding in the form of the precept. So for me, and I'm sure fellow PCCs right across the country, legitimacy, support and cooperation are very much more than headings on an HMIC report. They're of course fundamental to observance of the principles, and in very basic and practical terms, they literally and directly affect my ability to fund the force and to resource the function. The challenges are, the police are facing challenges right across the board. And through history, that's always been the case. After all, since the Garden of Eden, mankind have been taking and doing things that they're not supposed to do. Human nature doesn't change, but the pace and the manner in which the challenges can gain traction and impact is increasing exponentially every year, never more so than in the last 18 months. The pandemic, of course, has perhaps been the biggest crisis in every sense since the Second World War. Policing has faced huge challenge. I don't need to rehearse here the challenge of trying to enforce a mix of law, guidance and advice, never going to be an easy task. Laws created in a hurry, frequently changing and adapting, albeit necessarily, developments in a confusing and frightening environment for everybody. And for many, the police had absolute support of the public, but for a significant number, the challenge to those laws, and probably more so to the government, was manifest in antipathy, occasionally resistance, and even violence towards the police as the organisation charged with enforcement, caught in the middle as always. I'm sure my postbag was not untypical in being almost 50-50 split between those members of the public who felt the police were enforcing COVID restrictions in an overbearing manner versus those who felt the police weren't doing enough, the classic no-win scenario. George Floyd and BLM, of course, who'd have predicted the impact here in the UK of events thousands of miles away in the United States? But as we know, the killing of George Floyd led to scenes of disorder and cries to defund the police here. And the impact of that continues to be felt in the service today. Some of it, I have to say, good, because it has made us focus on diversity and representing our communities. And of course, the appalling murder of Sarah Everard by a police officer has done untold damage to the legitimacy of the police. The loss in the face of many, rightly or wrongly, of that vital public respect essential to the service. And it's also shone a light onto what we have to concede is a poor record in terms of dealing effectively with sexual crimes against women and girls. And it's an area where we have to do better. Climate change, of course, next, it's brought different challenges to policing. In the eyes of many, the responses have been slow and timid. To others, of course, overbearing as ever. The nuances of having to carefully observe the law in dealing with these issues are lost on the truck or taxi driver stuck in a 5-mile traffic jam trying to get to work while protesters blew themselves to the roads. And at moments like that, you can understand the public wondering why they're paying more tax for policing. And then my last point, really, the media and social media, perhaps the biggest challenge of all. Dealing with our communications in a world where every member of the public with a phone is an on-the-spot reporter with access to thousands of instant viewers without constraint, without training or rules, but often with an agenda. And on the flip side, the police who have to deal with that, but of course with all the significant legal constraints they have on what they can say and how they can respond. And often that leaves them wrong-footed in the eyes of the public. There are, of course, lots of other challenges, but these are significant. They need to be addressed. And I believe that adherence to the principles is absolutely key. The principles, as Tom has said and others, remain relevant. Our values and standards have to relate to them and continue to be developed to deliver those principles if we're to connect with, to win and retain the support and respect of the public. And it's of course key to be clear who the public are. I don't believe that the public are accurately represented by the very vocal Twitterati, the keyboard warriors on Facebook, but rather the silent but quietly observing majority who do still believe in law and order. They do still believe inherently in good policing, but they're challenged by what they see, and to be fair, in some cases with good reason. These are the people who we have to engage with effectively. Our communications have to improve. We need their support. We need their respect and cooperation. We have to be on the front foot in demonstrating our legitimacy through effective delivery of the principles with integrity, with the highest values, standards, and delivery. And all other considerations aside, it's simply the right thing to do.
Great, thank you, Peter. Really thought-provoking again. And I'm going to turn now to Caroline, who I am hoping will have some insights on the question of how you navigate some of those pitfalls of social media that Peter talked about, given your We Cops Twitter platform. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you. Yeah, it is nice to be introduced as a young person, but I am a police inspector in the City of London Police, and I do run We Cops, which is a sensible Twitter platform. We do hold some sensible discussions there, so join us on a Wednesday evening if you'd like to. I have prepared a brief slideshow. I don't know whether your tech person could bring that up for me. There we go. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to start off with actually talking about the Peelian Principles. Some historians debate whether these principles were written in 1829 by Robert Peel or indeed by the two police commissioners. It is quite possible that these principles were formulated over a century later by historian Charles Rees. So why is there such a strong affinity with a set of principles that hold no regulatory or legal bind? I think it's because on the surface they make good moral sense to a large majority of the public. But I argue that not all of the principles are relevant today, and they should not all be applied equally. There are some principles that stand the test of time. For example, of course, preserving life is fundamental to policing. You can have the next slide, please. Also, Principle 6, using persuasion, advice and warnings before resorting to force, is very relevant today. In fact, I used this last month. Slide 2, please. We utilise a 5-step appeal process in public order policing, and during a protest last month in London, before arresting people, we offered them these appeals to give them the opportunity to make different decisions. I think it's probably best in the interest of transparency. I confirm that they were arrested, but we still did offer them that opportunity to do something differently at that time. The notion that policing should solely focus on crime and disorder in Principle 1, although perhaps compatible with many ideologies, is now an outdated concept and is not a reality of modern day policing. Currently, policing is trying to do a bit of everything, a lot of which does not fall under the bracket of crime and disorder. This is partly because we are more aware of trauma, adverse child experiences and hate crime, and we are more alive to the necessity of protecting citizens in their own home and not allowing domestic abuse to continue unchallenged. More recently, the light has been shone on the need to protect women and girls in public and private spaces, and this is all really, really important. Slide 3, please. However, we are also plugging gaps in vacated spaces left by the decimation of many vital services. We are now the backstop and out of hours for many organisations and carry a huge responsibility and burden of a mental health epidemic exacerbated by COVID-19 and people being isolated from support. And of course, we can't forget the policing of the COVID restrictions. We have mentioned today the complex and messy task that policing was asked to complete, whilst also assisting with the COVID deaths. Myself and my colleagues spent many shifts in care homes as we saw starkly the true impact of the vicious virus. I believe we in policing are trying our very best, but like most public organisations, we're struggling to deliver the best service because our parameters are set so widely. I sit on the board for the National Policing Strategic Review, and this is one of our fundamental questions. What is the role of the police? This is problematic because the answer will be different for so many people and dependent on so many different factors. For example, what some people want in Hackney is very different to what some people want from their police officers in Hampshire. This makes Principle 2, maintaining public consent and respect, very challenging, especially when, anecdotally, and as we've discussed on social media, the country feels very polarised, with nuanced discussion and debate being replaced or at least demoted in favour of fixed and vehemently opposed opinions. But without respect and consent, our confidence levels waver, and with that, our legitimacy is threatened. So how can we utilise the public or keep them on board? Recent research by Andy Higgins from the Police Foundation showed that the public's traditional Peelian principles around crime and disorder actually adapt when we enter into a more sophisticated conversation with them and give them a new and more contextual information about demand, threat and risk. The research shows that the public then move towards a more long-term problem-solving approach when asked to rank in priorities, and they select more complex and harmful issues over things like their property and antisocial behaviour. This is so important as we find ourselves in a much more complex society with crimes such as cybercrime and fraud, which few people understand, but they really should, as these dominate so many harms. Next slide, please. Principle 7 describes people's civic duty to look after their community and to assist in policing. However, since 2010, we have seen a significant increase in the levels of violent crime, and the public do appear concerned to be stepping in to help. Instead, policing has become an arena of entertainment, of live streaming and video clips supplementing TV programmes or being posted on social media, where the judicial process is then played out in these forums by a large section of society based on limited evidence, and a short clip can have a lasting impact on public perception. Last slide, please. The police officer's uniform has also been stepped up to match the levels of violence since the inception of the Peelian Principles, introducing a more military-style feel, further disconnecting them from the public and Peelian's 7 principle, the age-old policing catchphrase, the police are the public and the public are the police. To connect with all of society, policing itself must reflect society in every rank, being both diverse in colour, culture, gender and in class, so that we have a clearer understanding of the impact of our actions and strategies that we set. We have seen some inroads within this, specifically with women and representation increasing there. However, policing has only increased black officer representation by 0.3% in the last 10 years, and that's research from Stephen Walcott in 2021 from the Police Foundation. The Mayor of London has introduced an action plan to improve Black Londoners' trust in the MPS, but this will only come into effect in years to come. But we obviously have to start again somewhere. This is also work to do nationally, as a quarter of police forces don't have a black officer. Overall, I do believe these principles remain important at setting a model of consent and respect between the public and the police, but perhaps it's time to review the Peelian Principles and make them fit for policing in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you, Caroline. And there's a really interesting split, I think, in the panel and in the comments, actually, between on the question of actually how far are the principles still fit for purpose in the modern world, and how far do they need to evolve? There's some interesting views coming through. But before we get into the discussion, last but very definitely not least, Justice, can I hand over to you, please? You're on mute.
Hello.
Perfect.
Okay, so let me just try and bring up my presentation. I think doing it here would help me a little bit. Okay, so when I was asked to speak to the applicability of the, sorry, the IT, could you put up your slide? I think it's probably better. I can't see mine here. Thank you very much. Yeah. So when I was asked to speak to this, I wondered how could I possibly approach this, and now sitting here listening to what colleagues have already said. So one way to try to go at this is to look at it through the lenses of my own work on police legitimacy. And I think, as has already been said, if you look at the principles, at the heart of these principles is the issue of legitimacy. And I think when we look at it, we see the theme that you cannot really have or do police work without investing in the issue of legitimacy. That legitimacy is crucial to police work. And we see in the principles this notion that when we think about legitimacy, it's not just about the legality of police power. That is crucial. But we see in the principle that one needs to have some moral foundation for those powers, and that he sees in the kind of relationship that the police have with the public. And I was struck by this idea that the police have to always engage in this, build these relationships with the public. And that aligns very much with the way we currently view the notion of legitimacy, that it's a continuous dialogue between the police and local communities. It's more or less, I think one way to think about it is a 24/7 moral economy, right? It's always open for business, so to speak. And we see this very strongly in the principles. And the other point I thought I would highlight is how one begins to build legitimacy. And in the principles, I thought these four issues came up. One is this notion of effective use of police authority. Of course, we might have different views about the purpose of policing. What is it that police should focus on? Should they be concerned with petty offenses? Should they be concerned with high-level crimes and so forth? But I think one way to read the principles is that whatever the objectives of policing are, their ability to perform those functions will be crucial to building their legitimacy, a theme that I think is without doubt current. The other, of course, is what has already been mentioned, which is that the issue of the rule of law. And we see in those principles the idea that the police's job is merely to enforce the law as it currently stands, rather than to have any, if you like, make the law as they go, as it were. And then the point that has already been mentioned, that a strong emphasis on respectful treatment of citizens. Again, a theme that is current today when we focus on issues of procedural justice. And we have seen that both in the US and here, one of the main mechanisms to trying to bridge that gap between police and local communities is this emphasis on procedural justice, that police officers should learn to listen, to explain decisions, to show care for the well-being of local communities, and to be impartial in their decision-making. And I think finally, again, this is something that had already been mentioned, the issue of policing not colored by the social standing of citizens. And one way to look at this, I mean, when we talk about social standing, we can think about the different demographic groups that police have to deal with, whether We are looking at it in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of social class. These are matters that I think, even at the time, Peel was reflecting upon. And so today, when we have stop and search statistics that show disproportionality, this is something one suspect will be of deep concern to Peel, and will be wondering how does he bridge that gap. But we also see that, again, one of the reasons that criminologists have become particularly interested in legitimacy is as a mechanism for maintaining social order. So we have really strong body of evidence suggesting that when people perceive the police to be legitimate, they are more likely to supply them with information to help solve crime in local communities. And this is one theme we find in the principles, that, as it were, it makes business sense to invest in building legitimacy. But of course, we have to add that if you look at the issues of effectiveness, lawfulness, respectful treatment, and if you like, equal treatment as well, these are also moral obligations on the part of the police. So it's not just a question of business, but at least in Peel we see that. But I think probably the most striking thing in the principles as well is this recognition that you can sometimes have this tension between democracy and the rule of law. So in the principles, he talks about, yes, the police should seek and preserve favorable public opinion, but they must not pander to that opinion, right? Because we see, our impulse with democratic principles is that we want to do what the local community wants. What is the pressure from politicians, from local communities for a particular type of policing? Whether it's about the way we police minorities, whether it's about the way that we police immigrants or certain types of offenses, there can be that strong pressure on the police to pander to those public opinion. And Peel is saying, no, it is the duty of the police to uphold the rule of law, which would require them to respect individual rights, the human rights of individuals or certain communities. And I thought probably the most striking thing from this is from the principles as I read them was this attempts to problematize this relationship between democracy and the rule of law. I thought, and this is not on the slide, it's just when I was, I think I've got a few minutes, two things. And this is essentially what is not in the principles. And I think one of them is the notion of self-legitimacy. So we currently in the legitimacy research placing emphasis on the issue of how police officers perceive and understand their own legitimacy as individuals. So there is some evidence emerging that the more officers believe in their own legitimacy, the more likely they are to be committed to even what you might call the Peelian Principles of respectful treatment of citizens. So that's the one thing that I thought I would highlight. The other thing is about fairness within police organizations. So in the criminological work, there is concern with organizational justice. And organizational justice is essentially about how especially frontline officers are treated by their supervisors. And we have the evidence that when these officers are treated without respect and so forth, it affects the way they relate to local communities. So that's what I thought I will highlight. Okay.
Great, thank you all. There's some really interesting contributions.